It began like any other cold November morning on Yeonpyeong Island, a speck of land sitting dangerously close to the invisible line that divides two Koreas still technically at war. Fishermen prepared their nets. Children went to school. Soldiers stationed on the cliffs watched the grey horizon of the Yellow Sea, where silence is rarely peaceful. The sea air was heavy that day, dense with fog and static. What nobody knew was that, just across the water, North Korean artillery crews were loading their guns. At 2:34 p.m, the first shell landed. Then another. Then dozens more. The sound came before the shock, a deep, rolling thunder that shook windows and rattled hearts. Within seconds, Yeonpyeong was under attack. The island's small military garrison scrambled for cover as plumes of black smoke rose into the sky. Shells ripped through homes, ignited gas lines, and tore through concrete bunkers. Civilians ran toward shelters, clutching children, unsure whether this was a drill or the start of the end. It wasn't a test. It was real. Across the border, radar screens at South Korea's 2nd Fleet Command lit up in red. The officers stared for a second, then the alarm screamed. A full-scale artillery strike was underway, the first direct attack on South Korean territory since the 1950s. Within minutes, orders were shouted, phones rang, and missiles were primed. F-15 fighter jets were scrambled. The South Korean president was rushed to a secure bunker in Seoul. For a moment, nobody could tell if this was an isolated act of aggression, or the opening move of a war the world had spent decades avoiding. In Pyongyang, state television played martial music. Soldiers stood at attention as loudspeakers declared that the North had retaliated against what they called a provocation, a routine South Korean military drill. To the rest of the world, it looked like madness. But inside the Hermit Kingdom, it was theater, a display of fury carefully staged to remind everyone that the regime was still dangerous, still unpredictable, still capable of lighting a match. By 3 p.m, the island was burning. 2 South Korean Marines were dead, dozens wounded. Firefighters couldn't reach parts of the village because the shelling hadn't stopped. The world's media scrambled for information. In Seoul, television anchors whispered the words nobody wanted to say. This could be the start of something bigger. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the United States 7th Fleet received the alert. A message came through NORAD's early warning network. North Korean artillery engaged. Civilian casualties confirmed. In the Pentagon, analysts pulled up satellite images showing flashes from coastal batteries near the North's Haeju Peninsula. Within minutes, American and South Korean forces were coordinating a counterstrike. The USS George Washington, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, began moving toward the peninsula. One wrong move, one misinterpreted radar blip, and the Pacific would ignite. What makes this moment chilling isn't just the violence. It's how close the world came without realizing it. At the height of the crisis, both nations had nuclear weapons within striking distance. A single missile launch from either side could have drawn in Japan, China, Russia, even the United States. Generals knew this. Politicians knew this. But for civilians sitting in traffic that day in Seoul or Tokyo, life went on as usual. The world didn't stop. There was no global broadcast, no breaking news alert loud enough to cut through everyday noise. The apocalypse, for a few terrifying hours, was happening quietly. Inside the South Korean Joint Chiefs Command room, a young officer named Kim kept staring at the wall of screens. He watched the shell trajectories, the heat signatures, the smoke. His hand trembled over the command switch that would authorize return fire. "Do we strike back?" someone asked. There was a long silence. Finally, the answer came from the top. Yes. Minimal response. Within seconds, South Korean K-9 howitzers thundered to life. Shells screamed across the sea and slammed into North Korean positions. The counterattack was fierce but restrained, a message. We are not starting a war, but we will defend ourselves. For 3 hours, both sides exchanged fire. Over 170 shells launched from the north, nearly 80 fired back from the south. When the smoke finally began to clear, the island was scarred and silent. Houses were nothing but splinters. The air smelled of salt and gunpowder. The survivors emerged from shelters to find their world changed. One man, his hand still shaking, said later that he thought he was witnessing the first battle of World War III. At 6 p.m, as darkness fell, the North suddenly stopped firing. No explanation. No warning. The guns went silent as abruptly as they had begun. On the other side, South Korea's defense minister waited for the order to escalate, an order that, thankfully, never came. Somewhere in the chaos of communication between Seoul, Washington, and Beijing, back-channel diplomacy had done its work. The world stepped back from the brink. The storm passed. But the tension didn't fade. Overnight, the United Nations called an emergency meeting. Western leaders condemned the attack. China called for restraint. Reporters were flown to Yanpyeong to film the smoldering ruins. And yet, within days, the story was gone. The headlines moved on. The world forgot. But behind closed doors, intelligence agencies quietly concluded that it had been the closest the Korean Peninsula had come to full-scale war since 1953. Later investigations revealed chilling details. The North's artillery crews had targeted both military and civilian areas deliberately. Some shells had been loaded with incendiary compounds to maximize fire damage. South Korean radar operators had detected what they thought were aircraft forming up near the border, but those blips disappeared before they could confirm. For a few minutes, commanders feared an aerial invasion. Even the White House Situation Room went on standby for a potential nuclear escalation. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything went dark. Inside Pyongyang, celebrations were held. The regime broadcast victory footage, explosions edited with patriotic music, declaring that the imperialists had been repelled. But the truth was simpler. The attack had been a warning, a way for Kim Jong-il, old and sick, to remind the world that North Korea could still make the planet hold its breath. That night, on Yanpyeong Island, survivors huddled in emergency shelters lit by candlelight. The sound of distant waves mixed with the faint hum of helicopters evacuating the wounded. A mother whispered to her son that it was over. He didn't believe her. The horizon still glowed red. Thousands of miles away, in Washington, analysts reviewed what-if scenarios. What if the South had retaliated harder? What if a stray missile had crossed the wrong line? What if China had mistaken the movement of US ships for an attack? In one scenario, global conflict erupts in under 48 hours. The chain reaction starts with a miscommunication, spreads to regional allies, and ends with nuclear exchange. In simulation after simulation, the pattern was the same: humanity gone within days. And yet, the world never knew how close it came. News networks covered it briefly, between celebrity scandals and election updates. By the end of the week, Yanpyeong was just another headline that faded. But in intelligence circles, the event became legend. The silent crisis, the day when World War III almost began, and no one noticed. In the years that followed, North Korea continued to test missiles, sink ships, and threaten annihilation. The rhetoric grew louder, the technology deadlier. The players changed: new presidents, new generals, new slogans. But the fault line remained exactly where it had always been: one fragile border, one impulsive nation, one decision away from catastrophe. If you stand on Yanpyeong today, the island looks peaceful again. The houses have been rebuilt. The fishing boats still head out each morning. But beneath the calm surface, you can still see the scars. Crater marks on concrete walls. Shrapnel embedded in street lamps. Memorials for those who died that day. Locals say that when the wind is strong, you can still hear echoes, low rumbles that sound like distant artillery. Most of the world has forgotten what happened on November 23, 2010. But for those who lived through it, the memory is sharp as glass. The day when the sky turned black. The day when the sea caught fire. The day the world teetered on the edge of war, and somehow, miraculously, stepped back. Because history doesn't always announce itself with mushroom clouds or breaking news banners. Sometimes it happens quietly, in the space between two decisions, on a frozen island no one's ever heard of. And sometimes, the end of the world nearly arrives, without anyone noticing at all.